And now it's my honor and my pleasure to introduce tonight's keynote speaker, Maggie Haberman of the New York Times. You all know her work, her awards, which helped define the Trump era and really our entire political era, the constant scoopage that reminded us how much is on the line, how much we are trying to defend as journalists democracy here at home and abroad. What you might not fully appreciate is how much affection and respect her colleagues and her peers have for her. It is my great honor and privilege to introduce Maggie Haberman.
Thank you so much for the honor of having me give this address tonight. I want to thank the Overseas Press Club for this event, for the work you do to keep people informed about what's happening around the globe. As someone who reports primarily on domestic matters, I am in awe of the work all of you do. I just want to take a moment to say the last time I was in this room was 3 years ago for an event honoring my father-in-law who died earlier this year. There was no greater appreciator of the work of journalists than him. We have been for several years in a fraught moment, both for journalism and for democracy, a perfect storm of collision between rising authoritarianism and diminished understanding of why the news media exists. I grew up immersed in the world of foreign correspondence. My father spent 13 years overseas for the New York Times, first in Tokyo, then in Italy, and then in Israel. He covered pro-democracy uprisings, explaining to me that cinematic characters who play foreign correspondents, like Mel Gibson in The Year of Living Dangerously, in which the reporter flees the danger instead of staying behind for the story, were not realistic. No reporter would ever leave the story, he explained. And I had the honor of being a White House correspondent for the New York Times during a unique and tumultuous period in our country's history. My colleagues and I were routinely attacked as the enemy of the people by a president who had neither the understanding of nor interest in the significance of why we do what we do. He spent the entirety of his term treating the press as if it existed to serve as a publicity arm of his government. In an interview with my colleague Peter Baker and our publisher A.G. Sulzberger and myself, Trump made clear that he had never given thought to the role the press plays in the constitutional democracy. I asked him during this interview, as he complained about the media, what he understood us to do, what he thought our role was. And he replied that our role is to cover events accurately and fairly. That is our goal, always, but not our function. Trump rejected coverage of corruption within his government and about how he blurred the lines between the Trump administration and his family business, of his comments on and policies regarding race and immigration, and of his administration's mishandling of the coronavirus pandemic. I could talk about how taxing the last 5 years were on journalists in this country covering Washington, at a time when local news outlets are either closing or being bought and gutted by financiers who do not have a journalism background. I could talk about how journalists covering their government in the US have been demeaned by a public that increasingly gets its news from outlets that agree with their pre-existing mindsets. And yet we are so fortunate to have the protections of a free press that we have in this country. While Trump's approach to the press was dangerous, it was perhaps most consequential for colleagues overseas working in countries where dictators and despots use the words of a US president to justify their own crackdowns on the press. In 2016, there were 272 journalists imprisoned worldwide for their work. In 2020, the number was 274. And yet, 2021 had remarkable moments for journalism overseas and for the coverage of events elsewhere. Just this month, Maria Ressa, the fearless Philippine journalist reporting on the Philippine president's regime, was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for her work. She was co-awarded with the Russian journalist Dmitry Muratov. 2 months ago, there was remarkable coverage of the aftermath and fallout of President Biden's decision to pull the US out of Afghanistan after a so-called forever war that left thousands dead and cost trillions of dollars. Without Clarissa Ward at CNN showing images of the calamitous evacuations, the world would have been less educated. That's also the case with my remarkable colleague, Thomas Gibbons Neff, or TM, as those of us who knew him in DC refer to him. A former soldier himself who was earlier this year relocated to the Times' Afghanistan Bureau, TM was able to get out of Afghanistan this summer, but like that prototypical foreign correspondent my father once described, TM secretly returned to help evacuate colleagues, sending guidance about how to arrive at the airport safely for departure. His was a heroic act during a desperate several days on the ground in Afghanistan. Shortly after that, my colleagues at the Times exposed the actual facts of a drone strike in Afghanistan following the chaotic withdrawal, one which military leaders called righteous, but which killed several civilians, including children. Without their reporting, the public may never have known the truth. I talked before about the danger of Trump's words. It was his actions in his final days in office that have been the focus of some of the most alarming reporting over the last 9 months. Some of this we knew in real time. I reported on a weekend in December 2020 about Trump meeting with his former National Security Advisor Mike Flynn and others in the Oval Office as Flynn pitched him on quote-unquote rerunning the election, a plan that would have relied on government seizing the voting machines. We've learned more about that meeting since, as well as other means Trump was discussing to undo the results of a free and fair election and to maintain power. And we all watched in real time on January 6th as hundreds of his supporters stormed the seat of the federal legislature and tried to stop the certification of the 2020 election. During that riot, some of his supporters treated journalists as their targets. The Trump era was unique in that there was a president so willing to undermine a free press with the power of his position. But as an industry, we must also be careful not to treat threats to press freedoms as unique to one specific leader or official. These threats do not all take the same form, and they are not all equal, but they still exist in this country. To that end, I want to say how fortunate my colleagues and I are to work with David McCraw, our newsroom's top lawyer and also our fiercest advocate. As scary a time as this has been in so many ways, the stellar journalism that has emerged from it underscores not just why what we do is vital, but why the frequent criticism of how we do what we do has often lapsed into caricature. We are not a perfect industry, and none of us is perfect at the craft, but I believe we aim for good and get it right most of the time. Journalists and journalism are vital. All of our work is vital, and I am so honored to have been asked to speak. Thank you, and enjoy the souffle.